The air in the Athenian court is thick, a heavy blanket woven from dust, sweat, and the nervous breath of 501 jurors. It is a suffocating thing, clinging to the skin, tasting of salt and stale wine. Sunlight, sharp and unforgiving, spears through the open columns of the Stoa Basileos, illuminating the swirling particles of a city that has grown old and suspicious. This is not the bright, optimistic Athens of Pericles, the city of triumphant marble and bold new ideas. This is a city scarred by a long war, haunted by the ghosts of plague and the recent brutality of the 30 tyrants. The optimism has curdled into fear, and fear has a particular smell, a metallic tang like old blood on stone. The men packed onto the wooden benches are not philosophers. They are farmers, merchants, soldiers, men whose hands are calloused and whose patience has worn thin. They shift their weight, the scrape of their sandals on the floor a restless, shuffling sound, a chorus of impatience. They have heard the accusers, their voices ringing with practiced outrage, painting a picture of a monster, a corrupter of sons, an atheist who mocks the very gods who protect their city. And now they stare at the man accused, this strange, ugly creature who stands before them. He does not look like a monster. He looks like a gargoyle chipped from a forgotten temple, with his flat, upturned nose, his thick lips, and his bulging eyes that seem to take in everything at once. He is Socrates. He is 70 years old, barefoot as always, his simple woolen hemadion draped carelessly over a stocky, powerful frame. He does not tremble. He does not wring his hands or offer the theatrical tears that are the common currency of the Athenian courts. He simply stands, a pillar of unsettling calm in the center of a storm of his own making. For a long moment, the only sound is the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer from the agora, a rhythmic counterpoint to the tense silence in the court. Socrates closes his eyes, just for a second, and in that darkness, he is not a defendant, but a philosopher asking himself the final, most pressing question. What is this fear I feel in the air around me? It is not a fear of me, the man. It is a fear of the question itself. It is the terror of the unexamined, the raw panic of a soul forced to look at its own reflection for the first time. They want to kill not a man, but a mirror. And in that brief moment of inner quiet, he feels the familiar presence of his daemonion, the divine sign that has guided him his entire life. It is not a voice that commands, but a silence that warns. It has stopped him from entering politics, from charging fees, from making 1,000 small, compromising choices. Today, as he faces the prospect of his own death, the daemonion is silent. The absence of a warning is, in its own way, a form of permission. A quiet signal that this path, however dark, is not the wrong one. He opens his eyes, and they are clear, devoid of the panic that infects the room. He looks out at the sea of faces, men he has known his entire life, men he has questioned in the marketplace, men whose sons have followed him, captivated and changed. He sees not enemies but patients, souls suffering from the most dangerous disease of all, the certainty that they know when they do not. And he knows his defense cannot be a plea for his life. It must be one last treatment, one final, painful dose of the only medicine he has ever offered, the truth. What is wisdom, and why is the claim to it so often a declaration of war against the world? This is the question that hangs in the stifling Athenian air, the question that has brought this old man to the brink of death. It is a question that travels far beyond the stone courts of the 4th century before the Common Era, echoing down through the corridors of history to find us in our own age of supposed enlightenment. We live in a world drowning in information, where knowledge is a commodity packaged and sold, where experts declare truths from digital platforms and algorithms confirm our deepest biases. We have more answers at our fingertips than any civilization in history, yet are we any wiser? Or have we simply become more sophisticated in our ignorance, more skilled at defending the comfortable fortress of what we think we know? The trial of Socrates is not merely a historical event. It is a timeless parable about the terrifying, liberating, and ultimately courageous act of admitting 3 simple words: I do not know. It is the story of a man who chose to die rather than to stop asking questions, and in doing so, taught humanity that the first step toward knowing anything is to first, and most profoundly, know thyself. To understand the verdict that would eventually be passed in this courtroom, we must first understand the city that served as its stage. Athens in 399 BCE was a city living in the long shadow of its own golden age. The air itself felt different than it had 50 years prior. Then it was filled with the scent of ambition and possibility, the smell of freshly cut marble from the Parthenon, the sea salt promise of 1,000 ships returning to the Piraeus laden with tribute and goods. The sounds were of construction, of celebratory hymns to Athena, of the confident oratory of Pericles echoing across the Phoenix. The taste was of victory, of rich wine and honey cakes shared in the symposia where poetry and philosophy were born. The city's skin felt the cool touch of democratic stones, the certainty of its own exceptionalism. But that Athens was gone, defeated in the brutal generation-long Peloponnesian War by its grim rival Sparta. The city was now a place of ghosts and grievances. The air now carried the scent of decay, a faint, lingering memory of the plague that had wiped out a third of its people, a smell of fear and closed rooms. It carried the acrid smoke of resentment from a citizenry that had lost its empire and its pride. The sounds were different, too. The confident declarations had been replaced by the suspicious whispers of informants, the angry shouts of demagogues blaming philosophers and freethinkers for the city's moral collapse. The taste was no longer of victory, but of bitterness. The watered-down wine of austerity, the coarse bread of a struggling economy. And the touch of the city had changed. The democratic stones now felt precarious, a foundation shaken by the recent memory of the 30 tyrants, a brutal oligarchy installed by Sparta which had executed hundreds of citizens without trial. Though democracy had been restored, its skin was thin, its nerves raw. Any touch that felt like a challenge, any voice that questioned its fragile authority was perceived not as a healthy stimulus, but as a violent blow. Into this tense and traumatized city walked Socrates, day after day, a living embodiment of relentless questioning. He was not a politician seeking power, nor a sophist seeking payment. The sophists were the rock stars of their day, charismatic teachers who traveled from city to city, offering to teach the sons of the wealthy the art of rhetoric, the skill of making any argument, weak or strong, persuasive in the courts and the assembly. To a democracy that ran on public speaking, this was a superpower. The sophists promised success, influence, and the tools to bend the world to one's will. They dealt in opinions, in probabilities, in what was useful for the moment. Socrates was their antithesis. He sought not what was persuasive, but what was true. He offered not answers, but a method. A painful, irritating, and profoundly unsettling method of cross-examination he called the Elenchus. He saw the sophists as merchants selling intellectual poison, convincing men that the appearance of knowledge was more valuable than the thing itself. He was the city's self-appointed physician, and his diagnosis was dire. Athens was suffering from a fatal case of false confidence. And so he began his rounds not in a clinic, but in the bustling, chaotic heart of the city, the agora. It began with a puzzle, a divine riddle dropped into the heart of his life. His friend, the impetuous and devoted Grievances, had traveled to the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred site in the Greek world. It was a place nestled on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, a place where the gods were said to speak through a priestess, the Pythia, who breathed in sacred vapors from a fissure in the earth and uttered cryptic pronouncements. The air there would have been thin and cool, smelling of laurel leaves and the smoke of burnt offerings. The silence of the mountains would have been broken only by the murmur of pilgrims and the chanting of priests. In this charged atmosphere, Grievances asked a question of breathtaking audacity: is anyone wiser than Socrates? The Pythia's answer was unequivocal: no one is wiser. When Grievances returned to Athens and delivered the news, Socrates was not flattered, he was profoundly confused. His inner world, usually a space of rational inquiry, was thrown into turmoil. A monologue of disbelief must have echoed in his mind. Wiser me, the god must be mistaken, or perhaps this is a new kind of riddle, what do I know? I know how to ask questions, I know how to dismantle the arguments of others until they stand naked in their own contradictions. But what do I possess as positive knowledge? Nothing. I cannot give you a perfect definition of justice that withstands all scrutiny. I cannot tell you with certainty what courage is. I know only one thing with absolute clarity, that I know nothing of these great matters. How can a man whose only wisdom is the recognition of his own vast ignorance be the wisest of all? It makes no sense. Unless the wisdom is not in the knowing, but in the not knowing itself. Perhaps others, the men everyone considers wise, are not. Perhaps they are suffering from a blindness I do not share, the blindness of believing they know when they are just as ignorant as I am. This thought was not a comfort, it was a burden, a divine command disguised as a compliment. He felt a weight settle upon him, he had to test the oracle, he had to understand its meaning. This was no longer a personal pastime, it was a sacred duty. His life was no longer his own, it belonged to the god, to the question. And so began the mission that would define his life and seal his death. He decided to seek out the men with the greatest reputations for wisdom. His first subject was a politician, a man whose name Plato tactfully omits, but we can imagine him clearly. See him in the Agora, the sprawling marketplace at the foot of the Acropolis. The scene is a riot of the senses. The sight of merchants under striped awnings, selling everything from shimmering silks to pungent cheeses and live chickens. The sound of 100 conversations at once, a tapestry of bartering, gossip, and philosophical debate. The smell of baking bread, of spilled wine, of the sweat of laborers, and the expensive perfumes of the elite. Amidst this chaos, Socrates approaches the politician. The man is holding court, surrounded by admirers, his voice confident and resonant as he speaks of justice and the good of the state. Socrates waits patiently, then begins his work, his voice quiet and unassuming. "You speak so eloquently of justice," he might begin. "It is clear you have given it much thought. Could you do me a favor and help me understand what it is?" The politician, flattered, offers a conventional definition. "Justice," he declares, "is giving each man what he is owed." Socrates nods, his expression one of genuine curiosity. "A fine starting point," he says. "But what if a friend lends you his sword and then, having gone mad, returns to ask for it back? Is it just to give a madman back his weapon, knowing he might harm himself or others?" The politician hesitates. The simple definition begins to fray. The crowd leans in closer. For the next hour, Socrates applies his relentless, gentle pressure. With each question, he exposes a new contradiction, a hidden assumption, a flaw in the politician's certainty. The man's initial confidence drains away, replaced by frustration, then anger, then sullen silence. He is left standing there, his reputation for wisdom shredded before the eyes of his followers, exposed as a man who speaks with great authority on subjects he has never truly examined. As Socrates walks away from this encounter, he feels no joy, no sense of victory. His inner world is filled with a cold, clear sadness. He thought he knew, Socrates thinks to himself, but he did not. "I, on the other hand, do not know, and I know that I do not know. In this small way, it seems, the God was right. My wisdom, this human wisdom, lies not in having the answers, but in being free from the illusion that I have them." This was the birth of his understanding of Socratic ignorance. It is not a simple lack of knowledge. It is the active, conscious, and courageous awareness of the limits of human understanding. It is the antidote to what he called double ignorance, the state of being ignorant and being ignorant of your own ignorance. This, he realized, was the true sickness of Athens. The politician in the Agora is not a figure confined to ancient Greece. He is with us today in every boardroom, every political debate, every social media thread. He is the executive who champions a new strategy based on buzzwords rather than data, unable to withstand the first probing why. He is the pundit on television who speaks with absolute certainty about complex geopolitical events they have only superficially read about. He is the influencer offering life advice based on a shallow philosophy, whose confidence wilts under the pressure of real-world complexity. The Socratic method, the simple act of asking for definitions and testing for consistency, remains the most powerful tool we have against this modern plague of unearned certainty. It is the humble courage to question the expert, and more importantly, to question the expert within ourselves, that marks the beginning of true wisdom. The politician's anger was not just at Socrates. It was the rage of a man whose comfortable reality had been dismantled, who was forced to confront the terrifying emptiness behind his confident pronouncements. It is a rage we see every day in our own world, whenever a deeply held prejudice is challenged by a simple, honest question. Socrates did not stop with the politicians. His divine duty compelled him to continue his investigation. He turned next to the poets, the revered storytellers of Greek culture, men believed to be divinely inspired. He would find them in a quiet corner of the agora or at a symposium, a drinking party where the city's elite gathered. He would approach a man who had just recited a beautiful passage from Homer or a stunning ode of his own creation. The air would be fragrant with wine and roasted meat, the sounds of the lyre soft in the background. Socrates, a strange, sober presence, would ask, "That was a magnificent verse about courage. Can you explain to me what you meant? What is the nature of courage itself?" And the poet, a master of words and emotion, would falter. He could produce beautiful images of courage, but he could not provide a rational, consistent account of the concept itself. He was a channel for beauty, a vessel of inspiration, but he did not understand the philosophical content of his own work. Socrates concluded that they composed their works not from wisdom, but from a kind of instinct or divine inspiration, like prophets or soothsayers who say many fine things but have no real knowledge of what they mean. Finally, he went to the craftsmen, the artisans. Here at last, he found men who possessed genuine knowledge. A stonemason knew how to carve marble, a shipwright knew the physics of building a trireme, a potter knew the secrets of clay and fire. Socrates was impressed. Unlike the politicians and poets, these men could give a clear, rational account of their specific craft, but their success bred a fatal arrogance. Because they were masters of their own small domain, they believed themselves to be wise in all other matters, including the greatest matters of all: how to live a good life, what constitutes justice, what is the nature of virtue. Their expertise in one area had blinded them to their ignorance in others. This, Socrates realized, was the most subtle and dangerous form of false wisdom, and so his grim conclusion was confirmed. The oracle was right. His wisdom, a fragile and negative thing, a mere awareness of his own empty cup, was greater than the wisdom of those whose cups were full of confident ignorance. This relentless quest came at a tremendous cost. Athens was a society built on reputation and honor. To publicly expose a powerful man's ignorance was not seen as an intellectual service. It was a profound social humiliation, a public shaming. The men he questioned did not thank him for the gift of self-awareness. They hated him for it. Their initial embarrassment hardened into a slow-burning resentment. The whispers began to follow him through the agora. There goes Socrates, the clever speaker, who makes the weaker argument appear the stronger. He's an atheist, one of those natural philosophers who says the sun is a hot rock and the moon is made of earth. He is corrupting our sons, filling their heads with questions and turning them against their fathers and the traditions of our city. The corruption they spoke of was the most potent charge. Young men, particularly the bright, restless sons of the elite like Plato and Alcibiades, were drawn to Socrates like moths to a flame. They were fascinated by his method, by the way he could dismantle the most powerful figures in the city with a few simple questions. They saw in him an authenticity that was missing in the slick performances of the sophists. They began to imitate him, trying out the Elenchus on their own parents and elders, questioning the traditions and beliefs they had been raised to accept without question. To a father whose authority rested on "because I said so," this was intolerable. To a city whose stability depended on respect for tradition, this Socratic questioning felt like a corrosive acid, eating away at the very foundations of society. The anger of the fathers, the resentment of the humiliated politicians, the suspicion of the common citizen, it all began to coalesce, to harden into a formal threat. The Gadfly had been buzzing for too long, and the great, sluggish horse of Athens was preparing to swat him down. The pain of this process was not just felt by those Socrates questioned. The Socratic method is often seen as a clever debating trick, but to experience it is to undergo a kind of intellectual surgery without anesthesia. Imagine being a young, confident Athenian, your mind filled with the standard inherited beliefs about honor, duty, and piety. You approach Socrates, eager to display your intelligence. You offer a definition, and he begins to question you. At first, it feels like a pleasant conversation, but soon you feel a sense of unease. Your confident answers begin to sound hollow, even to your own ears. He leads you down a path of your own logic, and at the end of it, you find yourself staring into a chasm of contradiction. The belief you held so dearly, a belief that was part of the very structure of your identity, has crumbled into dust. You are left in a state of aporia, intellectual paralysis, confusion, the dizzying realization that you know nothing. It is a deeply humbling, even shameful experience. Some fled from this feeling, enraged and humiliated. But for a few like Plato, this moment of intellectual demolition was not an end, but a beginning. It was the necessary clearing of the ground, the removal of the rubble of false opinion, so that the slow, difficult work of building true knowledge could begin. This painful, necessary struggle is at the heart of what Socrates meant by his most famous declaration, a statement made in the courtroom itself, when he was offered a choice between exile with silence or staying in Athens and facing death. He chose death and gave his reason in 10 words that would become the central creed of Western philosophy: the unexamined life is not worth living. This is perhaps the most important concept to unpack using our layered exploration. First, what does it mean? On the surface, it is a radical claim. Is a simple life, a life of honest work, family, and simple pleasures, truly worthless if it is not accompanied by constant philosophical reflection? Socrates would argue that it is not about complexity but about awareness. An unexamined life is one lived on autopilot, guided by unthinking habit, inherited prejudice, and the opinions of the crowd. It is a life where we never ask why we believe what we believe, why we value what we value, why we are pursuing the goals we pursue. It is a form of spiritual sleepwalking, a ghost-like existence where our choices are not truly our own. For Socrates, the capacity for rational self-reflection is the defining characteristic of being human. To fail to use it is to fail to live a truly human life. It is to be a beast of burden, content to follow the path laid out for you, never looking up to question the destination. Now let us imagine the scene where this conviction is forged. It is not a sudden epiphany in a courtroom, but a conclusion built over a lifetime of nights spent in thought. Picture Socrates in his modest home, long after his wife Xanthippe and his children are asleep. The city is quiet. The only light comes from a single, sputtering olive oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the wall. He sits on a simple wooden stool, the cool night air on his bare feet. Outside, he can hear the distant barking of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Inside, there is only the sound of his own thoughts. He thinks of the men he met in the agora that day, men chasing wealth, power, reputation, all convinced that these things will bring them happiness. He sees their lives as a frantic, desperate race toward a finish line that is an illusion. They are so busy running, they never stop to ask if they are on the right course. His own life, by their standards, is a failure. He is poor, he holds no office, he is becoming unpopular, yet he feels a sense of rightness, a deep alignment that they lack. His inner monologue might be a quiet prayer, a conversation with the God inside him. They think living is simply the drawing of breath, the satisfaction of appetite. But that is not it. Life is the tending of the soul, and the soul is tended not by feasting or by honors but by truth. To seek truth, one must question, one must examine. A day without questioning, a day without this examination of myself and others would be a day my soul starves. If they offer me a life where I must be silent, they are not offering me life at all. They are offering me a tomb with a beating heart, a breathing death. It is not a choice between life and death. It is a choice between two kinds of deaths. How does this ancient, dramatic choice apply to our lives today? The unexamined life is the default setting of modern existence. It is the endless scroll through a social media feed, a stream of images and opinions designed by algorithms to keep us passively engaged, never deeply questioning. It is the commute to a job that drains our spirit, pursuit for a salary to buy things we are told will make us happy, a cycle we rarely have the courage to interrogate. It is the family dinner where everyone stares at their own screen, present in body but absent in soul. Socrates' declaration is a terrifying call to arms. It asks us to turn off the noise, to put down the distractions, and to ask the hard questions. Why am I doing this? Do I truly believe this? Is this making me a better person? Is this life, the one I am living right now, truly mine? The courage required to ask these questions is immense because the answers may demand that we change everything. The unexamined life is not worthless because it is simple, but because it is inauthentic. It is a life lived according to someone else's script. Socrates' final act was to insist, on pain of death, that he would rather be the author of a short, tragic story than an actor in a long and comfortable farce. This commitment to the examined life was built on another foundational Socratic pillar, the belief that virtue is knowledge. This is one of the most challenging and misunderstood of his ideas. At its core, it is the assertion that no one does wrong willingly. All wrongdoing, from a petty lie to a monstrous act of cruelty, stems from ignorance. When people choose to act unjustly, it is because they are mistaken about what is truly good for them. They are chasing a phantom good, like pleasure, wealth, or power, and are ignorant of the fact that in doing so, they are harming their own soul, which is the greatest harm of all. For Socrates, a moral failing is a cognitive error. It is a miscalculation of what constitutes one's own ultimate self-interest. Therefore, the cure for vice is not punishment, but education. To teach a person the true nature of the good is to make it impossible for them to act against it. Let's place this idea in a scene. Imagine Socrates in a dialogue not with a politician, but with a young man who has been caught stealing. The authorities want to punish him, to flog him or fine him. Socrates pulls him aside. He does not scold or condemn him. He begins to question him. "You stole this loaf of bread," he says. "Why? Because I was hungry," the young man replies. "And you believe that satisfying your hunger is a good thing?" "Of course. But in stealing it, you have made the baker angry, you have broken the city's law, and you have made yourself into a person who is known as a thief. Does this reputation, this enmity, this lawbreaking contribute to your overall well-being, to the health of your soul?" The young man, expecting a lecture, is forced to think. Socrates continues, is there not a greater hunger than that of the stomach? The hunger for a good life, for self-respect, for a place of honor among your fellow citizens. In satisfying the lesser hunger, have you not starved the greater? Through this dialogue, Socrates is not trying to excuse the crime, but to diagnose the ignorance that caused it. The young man believed his immediate physical comfort was the highest good, ignorant of the deeper, more lasting harm he was doing to his character, his psyche. If he could be made to know, in the deepest sense, that the health of his soul was his most precious possession, he would never choose to harm it for something as trivial as a loaf of bread. This Socratic principle has profound implications for how we view justice and human behavior today. Our legal systems are built largely on the idea of punishment as a deterrent, assuming that people make a rational choice to do wrong. Socrates would challenge this. He would look at corporate greed, at environmental destruction, at political corruption, and he would not see evil masterminds. He would see profound ignorance. He would see people who have mistaken profit for well-being, power for purpose, and material accumulation for a good life. He would argue that our prisons should be more like universities, our punishments more like intensive philosophical tutoring. This is not a soft or permissive view, it is an incredibly demanding one. It suggests that true, lasting moral change cannot come from force or fear, but only from the difficult, painstaking work of acquiring genuine self-knowledge. It is the ultimate expression of faith in the power of human reason to overcome our most destructive impulses. So the stage was set for the final confrontation. The accusers, Anytus the politician, Meletus the poet, and Lycon the orator, brought their formal charges before the court. Socrates, the unholy trinity of their wounded pride, stood accused of impiety and corrupting the youth. His defense, as recorded by Plato in the Apology, is the masterpiece of his life. It is not an apology in our modern sense of an admission of regret. It is an apologia, a reasoned defense, a justification of his entire existence. He does not flatter the jury. He does not appeal to their pity by parading his weeping wife and children before them, a common and effective tactic. Instead, he does the one thing he knows how to do: he philosophizes. He turns his own trial into one last, great Socratic dialogue with the entire city of Athens as his interlocutor. He systematically dismantles the charges. He cross-examines Meletus, tying him in logical knots, making him look foolish before the entire court. He explains the origin of his mission, the riddle of the oracle, and his discovery of Socratic ignorance. He describes himself not as a threat to the city, but as its greatest gift, a gadfly sent by the god to sting the great and noble but sluggish horse of the state, to keep it from falling into a deep slumber of moral and intellectual complacency. I am that gadfly, he tells them, which the god has attached to the state, and all day long and in all places I am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. You will not easily find another like me, and therefore I would advise you to spare me. It is a statement of breathtaking arrogance and profound humility, all at once. But the jury is not persuaded. The years of resentment are too deep. The fear of his unsettling questions is too great. They have been conditioned to see him as the caricature his enemies have created. They cast their ballots. The verdict is guilty. The margin is narrow, but the result is clear. The prosecution proposes the penalty, death. Under Athenian law, the defendant was now allowed to propose a counter-penalty. This was Socrates' chance to save his own life. His friends, like Crito, urged him to propose exile or a substantial fine which they would gladly pay for him. A reasonable, conciliatory gesture would likely have swayed the jury. But Socrates had no interest in being reasonable. He had an interest in being true. He stood before the jury once more. What is a just penalty, he asked himself, for a man who has spent his entire life trying to awaken his fellow citizens to the pursuit of virtue? His answer was the ultimate act of philosophical defiance. He proposed that his penalty should be a reward: free meals for life in the Prytaneum, the sacred public hall where Olympic victors and city benefactors were honored. A gasp of outrage must have swept through the courtroom. This was not a legal proposal, it was a profound insult. It was a declaration that he, Socrates, was not a criminal to be punished, but a hero to be celebrated. He was holding up one last mirror to the city, and the reflection it showed was of a people about to execute their greatest benefactor. The gesture sealed his fate. The jury, infuriated by his perceived arrogance, voted again. This time, the margin for death was much larger. Socrates was condemned to die. His reaction was not one of despair. He addressed the court one last time, not as a condemned man but as a prophet. He told those who voted against him that they had done a terrible thing not to him but to themselves. In silencing him, they had not escaped the questions. They had only ensured that the questions would return, more insistent, from others who would come after him. To his friends, he offered comfort, speculating that death was not a thing to be feared. Perhaps it was a peaceful, dreamless sleep. Or perhaps it was a journey to another place where he could continue his questioning with the great heroes and thinkers of the past. The hour of departure has arrived, he concluded, and we go our ways, I to die and you to live. His final days are a testament to the consistency of his philosophy. Confined to a prison cell, awaiting the day the executioner would arrive, he was a man at peace. His friends, led by the wealthy Crito, hatched a plan to bribe the guards and arrange his escape into exile. They presented the plan to him with desperate urgency. Crito's arguments were practical and persuasive. He spoke of Socrates' duty to his children, the grief of his friends, the injustice of the verdict. But Socrates responded with one final dialogue. He personified the laws of Athens, imagining them speaking to him, reminding him of the implicit contract he had made with them. He had lived his entire life under their protection, benefiting from the order and stability they provided. Did he now have the right to defy them simply because they had produced a result he did not like? To escape would be to answer one injustice with another, to destroy the very principles of civic order he had always claimed to uphold. It would be a betrayal of his entire life's teaching. He chose to stay. He chose obedience to the law, even when that law was a vessel for injustice. The day of his execution arrived. His friends gathered in his cell, their faces etched with grief. Socrates was calm, even cheerful. He spent his final hours in conversation, discussing the immortality of the soul. When the executioner came, a state official who wept as he handed over the cup, Socrates took it without trembling. The poison was hemlock, a paralytic that worked its way up from the legs, slowly chilling the body until it reached the heart. He drank it down as if it were a cup of wine at a symposium. He walked around the cell as instructed until his legs grew heavy. He lay down on the cot. His friends, who had been so strong, broke down in tears. Socrates gently rebuked them. "What is this strange outcry?" he asked. "I have been told that a man should die in peace." He covered his face. As the coldness crept toward his chest, he uncovered his face for one last moment and spoke his final words to Crito. "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please don't forget to pay the debt." Asclepius was the god of healing. Socrates' last words suggest that he saw death not as a punishment, but as a cure for the sickness of life, the final release of the soul from the prison of the body. Then he was still. The Gadfly of Athens was silent at last. But his questions were not. His death was not an end, but a catalyst. The traumatic execution of their master transformed his followers. For Plato, it was the defining event of his life. He had witnessed the most just man he had ever known be condemned to death by a democratic city he had tried to serve. This paradox, the conflict between the ideal of justice and the flawed reality of politics, became the central obsession of Plato's own philosophical work. He founded his academy, the first great institution of higher learning in the Western world, to educate a new generation of leaders who would be guided by reason, not by popular opinion. He wrote his famous dialogues, preserving and immortalizing the Socratic method, making his martyred teacher the protagonist in a grand philosophical drama that would shape the next 2.5 millennia of thought. The legacy of Socrates is a testament to the power of a single life committed to a single, profound idea. The idea that wisdom begins in wonder, that virtue is a form of knowledge, and that the only life worth living is one dedicated to the relentless, courageous, and unending examination of itself. Today, we stand in the echo of that Athenian courtroom, facing our own juries, our own choices. The hemlock we are offered is not a poison in a cup, but the comfortable sleep of unthinking conformity, the soothing balm of willful ignorance. Socrates' life is a permanent challenge to that comfort. It asks us to be the gadflies in our own communities, in our own workplaces, and most importantly, in our own minds. It teaches us that the most courageous act is not to have all the answers, but to be willing to live in the tension of the question. He left behind no books, no system, no doctrine. He left only a method, a spirit of inquiry, and a final, haunting silence. And so we are left in the silence that follows the question, the same silence he left in the agora, forced to ask not what Socrates knew, but what we have the courage to admit we do not.